Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to our session titled, What's the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act Means for Our Region? My name is Michael Chajes, and I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Delaware, where I also serve as Dean of UD's Honors College. And I've been a CCL volunteer since 2016. Today, it's my great pleasure to host a conversation with longtime friend, golf buddy, and fellow engineer, Dan Faust. Before we get started, I just want to mention that we will leave time for questions for the audience during the last 10 minutes or so of this session. As your questions arise, please address them to Ask Me Noel in the chat, and our volunteer, Noel Smith, will be sorting and synthesizing your questions for the Q&A session at the end. This session is being recorded, so you will have an opportunity to review it again after the conference concludes. So as I said, I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to Dan. Over the years, we've had many discussions about sustainability, especially as it relates to the engineering profession. So I know he has many valuable things to say about how we can ensure that this historic infrastructure bill leads to sound projects that benefit our economy, our communities, and our environment. Dan is a University of Delaware alumnus, although he graduated before my time as a faculty member. But I'm still proud of the illustrious career he has had over the past 35 years. We first met when he worked for the Delaware River Port Authority in Philadelphia, where he eventually rose to become chief engineer and director of engineering, responsible for the development and implementation of DRPA's capital program across its core facilities, including 4 long-span toll bridges, a commuter rail system, and various ports and marine facilities. Dan is currently the chief executive for the U.S. East Region and Central and South America of AECOM, one of the largest and most trusted infrastructure consulting firms in the world. Dan is responsible for all AECOM business units in the region, including transportation, environmental, water resources, power, construction management, and architectural and building engineering. I can't think of anyone more well-positioned to help us understand the impacts that the infrastructure bill will have on our region and what concerned citizens should be on the lookout for as these funds and projects start rolling out. So welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for the very kind intro, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone today about a topic that I am very passionate about. So thanks for that intro.
You're most welcome. Let me start by saying that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was passed in November of 2021 with bipartisan support, and it provides some $1.2 trillion in funding, which is about $550 billion of new spending above baseline values. So Dan, let me start off by just asking, when can we expect to start seeing infrastructure projects getting underway in our region?
Yeah, a couple thoughts on that, Michael. I think we are already beginning to see that funding have an impact. Unfortunately, we're all very aware of the sudden collapse of a bridge in Pittsburgh. One of the features of the new funding is that off-system bridges, so those bridges that are owned locally and throughout the various states, are eligible for 100% funding to refurbish, replace, repair bridges. So that's actually one of the projects that we'll see benefit from this new bill. Pennsylvania, or the city of Pittsburgh, will use 100% federal funding. There's talk of similar types of projects throughout the country. One in my backyard called the Mount Vernon Bridge in Alexandria is also being sort of touted for that. So we're starting to see some of the funding actually kind of work its way into the system, and we're starting to see the benefits. I would point out, though, that this funding is a little bit different than what we saw a few years ago under the Obama administration, where primarily the focus of that funding was around jobs and what was termed shovel ready. And so we'll see a little bit more of a delay, as particularly around some of the projects that are really driving some policy changes that I know that we're going to talk about in a minute. So there'll be a little bit longer gestation period here for this funding that we saw with with the prior big infrastructure funding from a few years ago. But we are starting to see it. Yeah.
Great, wonderful. All right, so next, Dan, as the leader of one of the largest civil infrastructure companies in the region and country, what do you see as AECOM's role in the infrastructure renewal that will be made possible by the new funding?
Yeah, well, as you know, Michael, and I think all of us here know, historically, sustainability and climate resilience have been underfunded when it comes to infrastructure. So we're very excited that this bill will provide us the opportunity to work in partnership with our clients to better integrate sustainability and climate change into the projects. And that's really kind of the exciting thing about IIJA is it's much more outcome based. So we at AECOM have very much part of our corporate culture is around improving environmental and social outcomes. We have our own sustainable legacies initiative around that. If you were to go on our website, aecom.com, and you'll see sustainable legacies that you can click on. It's really all about improving outcomes. So we're excited to kind of bring that expertise and those passions to bear through this bill. Really, really very exciting. So, it's unprecedented, really.
Yep, I agree, Dan. I know our profession has really taken this on, I think, and it's really exciting to see. I know the students that I work with as well are doing that. So second, those of us gathered here, we have over 30 people in the audience today at this session, and we're here because we're really concerned. I know many people even alarmed about climate change, and we want to know that the changes in infrastructure, and we know changes in infrastructure will be needed both to adapt to the changes that are already baked into our climate system, such as the amount of sea level rise, as well as to need to mitigate climate change by reducing emissions. So what would you see in terms of provisions of the bill that we should be aware of that will contribute to either climate adaptation or mitigation for our region?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the figure 550 billion. So we'll kind of start there, that there's an incremental funding of that 550 billion in new spending over 5 years that is specifically targeted towards making progress in Paris Agreement targets around reducing carbon emissions. Basically, that goal is to reduce from the 2005 baseline levels carbon emissions, cutting carbon by 50% by 2030. So really, that's broadly what we see as the sort of the North Star when we look at the objectives of this bill. Specifically, there are a number of areas that we should be excited about. I will say that each of the federal agencies are in the process of developing their own methodologies for spending that money, but some that we know about. There's $7.5 billion for a national network of electric vehicle charging, which is sorely needed, obviously, in order to transition from fossil fuels to an electric fleet. We need those charging stations for that to happen. That's a significant investment. $5 billion in zero and low emission school bus funding. There's an overall $6.4 billion to reduce carbon use across the surface transportation network. So within agencies and sectors, their own carbon footprint is the reduction of carbon is being sort of facilitated through significant funding. And really broadly, I would say, much of what this administration is looking to achieve is improvements and more funding for transit, and really challenging some of the project priorities we've seen in the past around expanding highways and really putting investments into fossil fuel driven facilities. And so I think there's an objective there that overall will be very helpful towards achieving those Paris Agreement targets.
All right, great. As you know, one of the great things about CCL is it's an organization where its membership is very engaged in the process of government and trying to work with our elected officials to have the political will to do what we think needs to be done. So you have some really engaged people in the audience who are willing to roll up their sleeves and get involved. So how would you suggest concerned citizens like those in the audience get engaged in the process that's going to come about to ensure the best, most sustainable outcome for the infrastructure projects in their area?
Yeah. Well, there's a few ways. I would say first and foremost, make sure you're informed and staying current with developments. Social media is a great way to do that. Many companies like AECOM partner with local communities and climate conscious organizations, and all of that activity is easily accessible. I mentioned our sustainable legacies previously. That's a great place to go at AECOM to sort of keep up with all of that activity and participate in forums and have your own voice be heard. I would say also there are any number of local, at every level of government, wherever you happen to be, many local communities have climate focused committees and panels, so people can get involved and contribute their time and their voice through that forum. One of those committees that we're very, very much involved with is a volunteer committee in the city of Miami. It's a climate resilience committee that's comprised of residents, and through that have developed a resilience action forum. If you don't know, Miami is a place in the world that really, if somebody who wants to really see the impacts of climate and climate change, I would advise them to spend some time in Miami, because that's a significantly impacted community. And then finally, there's also non-government organizations and grassroots organizations that are tackling climate issues. The Nature Conservancy is a great one. The United Nations Youth in Action Program. Of course, what we're doing here with CCL, I mean, great way to just get involved and continue to stay involved. So it's really, I think there are any number of ways for people to get involved and to stay informed.
All right, thank you. I'm going to turn back to our industry a little bit. So the civil engineering industry hasn't always necessarily had sustainability at the forefront throughout its history. I'd say that, for a long time, I think the motto of industry was to have projects run on time and on budget. And we now know it's a broader issue. And I know that it's a personal concern of yours. So I'd like to ask you, as part of that engineering community, are you optimistic that we are making adequate progress towards sustainability in our goals and processes and the materials we use?
I'm optimistic. I am. I think the sort of this legislation that we're talking about and we're also excited about is really an opportunity for the industry to step up, and it will ultimately we'll see how in a few years how successful we are. But I think certainly you couldn't ask for much more if you're somebody that isn't concerned about climate and carbon reduction. This is the bill that you wanted to see. And so I am optimistic. We do see, in more practical terms, we do see that our agencies are increasingly investing and collaborating around these types of issues. One project that is really near and dear to us, I'm going to just mention a couple in my backyard in DC. One is the new Frederick Douglass Memorial Bridge, which is really a marquee bridge that is connecting the underserved communities in DC to that area that is really exploded around the new stadiums, with all kinds of green infrastructure and sustainable materials, the use of bioretention swales and rain gardens and pollinator meadows, all of those types of things really built into into green infrastructure and overall a really sustainable design. We also see the DC public schools and their net zero energy. We work very closely with them, their net zero energy initiative, which has the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2032. And so we see our clients really taking hold of these issues, and we're excited to work with them on it. So I am optimistic, Michael. Yeah.
Great. You were on campus, I think a few months ago, talking to one of our classes. And I teach a class on sustainability, both to engineers and to non-engineers. And I know you talked about, I thought it was really interesting about how companies in our industry now have an ESG platform, and I notice I have my students go out and look at company websites, and it's pretty prominent. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of that within the industry? I think so. This is ESJ is equity and social justice platforms, and I know that when Dan was talking to our students, said, if you're interested in this area, if you're passionate about that, make sure you look at what companies are saying. I know AECOM has a very strong one. So how did that all evolve, and is that sort of the future?
Yeah, well, I think the majority of Fortune 500 companies have made commitments to ESJ, and AECOM is sort of at the forefront of it. We're happy to see it. So really, you see in our country, and whether people kind of like it or not, ultimately, the money and the investing and the success of private industry, can tell us a lot. And when you see the majority of Fortune 500 companies adapting ESJ platforms, that really ought to tell you something. And so I think it's been an amazing sort of sea change that we've witnessed here in the last couple of years. Very, very exciting. And again, we'd like to believe we've kind of been out in front of this trend through the work that we do. But I think also, and a lot of it is driven, frankly, by the younger generation, and this really desire for meaningful outcomes and following one's passion. And that's what I would sort of recommend anybody do in terms of kind of choosing a profession is skills can be trained, but passion can't, right? And so I think we see that passion really having an impact. It's kind of great to see. It's heartwarming, right? That this younger generation that's coming up is demanding the kinds of ESG things that we're seeing now. So a lot of growing demand for expertise in the area of environmental justice, climate resilience, and sustainability. And so I'm sure, Michael, the University of Delaware is really focused on training that next generation of experts in that area. And so all good stuff. Yeah.
Well, I was actually in a high school yesterday doing some work on food waste, and we were installing a digester that basically deals with the food waste in a more sustainable way. And you wouldn't believe how many people stopped in to see what was going on, and teachers were bringing their students in, and it was just, there was a lot of energy around that. So you've mentioned, we may have some younger people in the audience. You mentioned some areas. I don't know if there are any other areas that you think if someone in high school or college or for our audience, it could be someone's grandchild out there who starts thinking and asking them, hey, I really want to get into an area where sustainability broadly is gonna be something I can contribute to the solution to. Whether you have any other additional ideas about where that is? Yeah,
no, I mean, I do think it's a historic time for our industry, civil engineering, right? And so I think it was the tech sector 20 or 30 years ago in Silicon Valley, and I think it's infrastructure. And that really does speak to civil engineering. I think the environmental sciences will be very, very in demand as we move forward. And I think the training that we give to students at universities around kind of the integration of things like environmental justice and how we kind of do equity audits and feasibility studies and look at risk are all kind of really interesting areas. But I do think you'll find all of that within the civil engineering industry, in particular around environmental and some of the stormwater and coastal engineering areas. I think would be very, very significant areas for people to look at if they're passionate about climate change.
Okay, great. I do have to put I think both Dan and I realize, I'm not sure, I don't know how widely this would be understood, but with this type of infrastructure spending, I think there's, in my opinion, a great shortage of people working in this area. It's not been the area that's drawn recently the most attention. I think as this money starts rolling out, the industry is going to be really looking for people broadly to work in this area. So if you know of people looking for careers, I think it's a great one to get.
Salaries will be on the rise, and I mean that that is the challenge of the next generation as far as an industry, Michael, is resources. How are we going to get all this done? How are we going to make sure that this investment is used wisely and it actually is used, because I think we are under resourced in terms of the experts. It's a great point. Yeah,
it's going to be interesting. All right. Well, I think I wanted to leave some time for questions. I want to leave 10 minutes. We have 10 minutes now, so I think we're going to turn to that. So remember, if there are people still out there who have questions, I know some have come in, but remember, you can ask your questions to Ask Me Noel. And Noel, why don't you come on and tell us what we're asked?
Yeah, we have several really good questions that came in, and I'm going to start on materials. And I guess in the context of sustainability, in civil works, much of the emissions will be related to the materials chosen, and concrete and cement and steel are likely the largest contributors. And the questions around, with concrete particularly contributing upwards of 7% of the world's carbon emissions, as big as some countries' emissions. And there's been a lot of research done to mitigate the adverse impacts of concrete and steel by using lower emissions materials for these. Are you familiar with these materials, and do you think it's viable to use in infrastructure projects around the world?
Yeah, it's not an area that I have a ton of expertise in, so I'd be lying if I told you that I could speak into this with a great deal of depth. I am aware, as you stated, Noel, there's a lot of work and focus in this area around reducing emissions and in general looking at ways to build in lower emissions, not just in concrete, but really the entire life cycle and supply chain of all materials. I mean, we've had some of our experts really involved in the work stream of some of those things. So I think it's definitely an area of interest and something that we're going to see as we move forward. And maybe we'll see as a result of that and through some of the objectives of the funding that we're talking about, that some newer materials will become available and more, kind of rise to the top as we decide and select what materials we want to use. So
yeah,
but yeah,
I'll just jump in quickly also that it is something that it takes time to transition. So there's definitely people in universities and places doing research on this. I know I was a couple of years ago in Australia, and they were billboards about net zero bricks that they were using. The issue with cement is that it takes tremendous heat to generate the cement. So they're looking at lower cements that can be generated with using much less heat. So I think we'll make progress. And as Dan said, I think we'll find some different materials to start using as well.
Yeah.
Great, thanks both for those answers. The next one is similar. It's about lowering emissions, but through carbon capture. And this person's interested in carbon capture technology and has some concerns based on what they've read in the marketplace. So I guess, could you share your knowledge of carbon sequestration technology? I think there's about 10 billion in the bill for these types of projects. So yeah, if you want to give any thoughts on what either AECOM has done or knows about this, or just what you've gleaned from that in general as far as the viability of that going forward.
Yeah, we think it's still, we think there's room here for improvement. But I did not mention that as kind of one of the areas. I only kind of picked out three in kind of focusing or talking about where the bill is investing. But yes, sequestration is one of those areas that I think requires a lot more investment and a little more development. And so I would agree with the concern, but I also think that the funding and the recognition and the funding for that technology is there. And so I'm optimistic. Michael, I know this is an area for you as well of interest. I don't know if you had any thoughts about the technology specifically. I do not. But
yeah, I mean, there is, again, it's just I think that one thing we're hopefully getting better at as a research enterprise is the speed that we get things from the laboratory into practice. And you look at the pandemic and how quickly we got vaccines into, into production. So carbon capture is one of those areas that right now is not very economic, and which is why it's not being used. But I've seen a number of approaches that look like they have promise. And so I think if we speed that up and put some money into it, we may very well find some things that are finally economic to do. That's been the problem up to now. We can do it, but it just costs too much.
Great, thanks. There's a couple questions in here about funding, about the bill, and I'll kind of try to wrap it all into a discussion. So some concerns or questions about how the funds are being divided amongst the states. Is it equitable? How is our region making out from this? And are there mechanisms in place to ensure that the money is being utilized in a sustainable way?
So there's a significant portion of the incremental funding that will be formula based. And so if for those that aren't familiar with the traditional formulas around in particular transportation funding, it is based on kind of the network that is existing and in place. And so those will be dollars along those lines, sort of that incremental investment will follow along with the formula. I'm not sure that's the answer you want to hear on that. I do think a good bit of good news on this is that we see something on the order of $150 billion that is discretional in grant money that is being divvied out entirely based on the objectives of the administration that we've been speaking about here today. So there's a process in place for cities and states and transit agencies and water utilities to apply for grants based on the objectives of ESG that we've been talking about. And so that will absolutely ensure, and then those grants will be awarded on the basis of meeting those objectives. And so there's also, it should be said, I sort of understood this a little bit from the question, and I think Beth has put something out there for us to look at on Justice 40, which is the executive order that the president has issued that basically 40% of federal investments in climate and clean energy be allocated to disadvantaged communities. So there's also part of this funding is really intended to be driven into work training and making sure that the communities that really see a benefit. Again, this outcome-based focus, I think, is really so. Check out that link, I think, that Beth just put up for more on Justice 40.
Can I ask for a little, this will educate me, Dan, because I don't know this perfectly, but when you talk about it depends on the network, my understanding was in terms of, for instance, monies for highways or for bridges, that a big part of, or some part of the formula is how many miles of interstate you have in your state. And of course, me and, for those of us in Delaware, we have a small number of miles of interstate. And so we don't get nearly as much. It's relatively, depending on your size, but is that a big factor, miles of interstate?
It is, miles and bridge inventory. And again, and those kinds of things. And again, I think that part of the intent of the grant program is to sort of normalize or address those kinds of inconsistencies. And something tells me Delaware might do okay with
I think we go an eighth in the hole there. So you're right.
Yeah.
Great. So the next question's around rehabilitation projects versus new builds, and some experts support much greater funding for rehabilitation rather than new builds in terms of the sustainability of that. And how is that playing out today? And is there anything in the new infrastructure bill to address that?
Yeah, no, there is, and it's a big topic of discussion. Federal government's been talking about asset management for a while, and there have been attempts to really drive policy and better asset management through policy and funding that have been unsuccessful. But this bill, I think, really is challenging. It's actually that the industry is somewhat up in arms about it, because they're having to go back. If you're familiar with the process of planning that exists within states, there are things called MPOs, which are metropolitan planning organizations, which develop regional transportation plans. And ultimately, that's what is the basis for rolling out a capital plan and all of the funding. Those things are sort of being stood on their head, because many of the objectives that are being developed here are minimizing things like capacity enhancements and causing those MPOs to have to go back and relook and reprioritize projects towards asset management and maintenance of existing facilities. And there's been some pushback, candidly. It's in our country, where politics is at the forefront of everything. We've seen in some states come together and actually object to some of those things and want less kind of what they term one size fits all approaches to funding, and want the flexibility to do capacity enhancements versus maintenance. And to a certain extent, it does vary, right? The Northeast states have much more of this issue than some of the faster growing states, but it is kind of at the forefront of this debate about expanding capacity versus maintaining is at the forefront of a lot of debate right now. Yep.
All right. I think we're at 2:25, which is when our session's supposed to wrap up. So I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. We apologize if your question didn't get answered, but feel free to email me. I think my email address has just gone in the chat. I'll look at those emails. I'll get in touch with Dan and we'll answer your email. So let us all thank Dan and all of you for joining today. It was a real pleasure having you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. So Dan,
Thank you.
everyone, thank you all.
Thanks.